On the morning of January 20, 2017, inside a secret military installation outside Washington, D.C., an 82-year-old man saw the face of the apocalypse. The man was Orrin Hatch of Utah, the senior Republican in the United States Senate, the president pro tempore of the Senate, and the longest-serving Republican senator in U.S. history. The face belonged to an American military officer stationed a few yards away, who carried a bulging 45-pound aluminum-framed, leather-encased briefcase known as the President's Emergency Satchel and nicknamed the Nuclear Football. The football contained the codes and communications equipment that would, when activated, enable Orrin Hatch to authorize the launch of thousands of nuclear weapons and bring much of the world to an end. A similar object carried by a military aide has closely followed every president since the climax of John F. Kennedy's Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. It is not clear where the name football came from. Some sources report that it was inspired by a Cold War plan called Operation Dropkick, but that referred to an insect warfare test, not a nuclear one. There was a fictional nuclear warfare rehearsal plan of the same name in Stanley Kubrick's end-of-the-world black comedy Dr. Strangelove, which may have inspired the nickname. Senator Orrin Hatch was one of the most prominent legislative architects of the post-Vietnam American nation, but now he was on the verge of gaining the power to join a series of events that would result in its utter destruction. Hours earlier, Hatch had vanished from sight. He was third in the line of succession to the presidency after the vice president, and perhaps the most familiar face on Capitol Hill, having served there for 40 years. He was the top Republican in the Senate, celebrating the election triumph of the first candidate of his party to assume the presidency in 8 years. He was expected to be at the head of a procession of congressional leaders, escorting Donald Trump through the halls of Congress to the west front of the Capitol for his inauguration as the 45th President of the United States. At Hatch's invitation, the famed Mormon Tabernacle Choir from his home state of Utah was preparing to sing America the Beautiful on the steps of the Capitol building. On this cold, gray day, more than 300,000 people were gathering in the nation's capital for the historic transfer of power, along with 28,000 security officers from the Secret Service, Transportation Security Administration, Coast Guard, National Guard, FBI, U.S. Park Police, and U.S. Capitol Police. They were joined by outgoing President Barack Obama, outgoing Vice President Joe Biden, former Presidents Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush, former Vice Presidents Dan Quayle and Dick Cheney, members of the Supreme Court, and Trump's vanquished opponent in the bitter 2016 election, Hillary Clinton. Orrin Hatch was nowhere to be seen. 67 Democratic members of the U.S. House of Representatives were boycotting the event for what they called Trump's divisive policies, his criticism of civil rights icon Congressman John Lewis, and what they cited as foreign interference in the election. Scattered protests and sporadic violence erupted on this day as demonstrators attempted to blockade the inaugural parade route, broke store windows, started fires in the street, and ignited a limousine, prompting police in riot helmets to fire tear gas, concussion grenades, and chemical spray. On the Capitol steps, First Lady Michelle Obama's face registered complete dejection at the prospect of Trump's swearing in. In the background, a military officer carrying a nuclear football discreetly prepared to shift his allegiance at the stroke of noon from Obama to Donald J. Trump, a man who, once he became the Republican Party nominee, had been strongly supported in his campaign for president by party giant Orrin Hatch. But where was Hatch? Friends and colleagues strained their necks to spot him in the procession down the Capitol steps, but he had vanished. At that moment, in fact, the senator was serving as a nuclear-armed backup president of the United States and sitting at a desk inside a top-secret command and control location outside Washington, D.C. He was accompanied by his wife, a few aides, and a security detail. Within close reach, a military officer was carrying a nuclear football identical to the one on the U.S. Capitol steps.